Hello everyone, and welcome to another of our guest interviews, followed by a live Q&A session together. We began this series by speaking to Johnny Prime, one of the directors of the FIEC, the national church movement to which we belong. And then a few weeks ago, of course, we had our own local hero, Gav Sant, sharing with us. Tonight, we're looking forward to hearing from John Risbridger. John is a graduate from Nottingham University, after which he went into NHS management. From there, he became head of the student ministries called UCCF. And then for the last 17 years, John has been team leader and minister of Above Bar Church, one of our neighbouring churches down the coast. So John has a lot of leadership experience, but also national perspective. He's been formerly chair of Keswick Ministries, and is currently involved on the National Council of the Evangelical Alliance. So John's a really good guy with lots of insight from different walks of life. So as we listen in to the conversation, be ready with your questions for that Q&A that follows. Some of the issues that John and I will be discussing and exploring together revolve around how churches like ours move from lockdown into the new normal of the future. What kinds of churches do we need to be in mission, in discipleship? And then how do we respond to the Black Lives Matter movement, issues around racial justice and racial inequality? That's just a little heads up on what's to come. Enjoy the conversation and be ready with your questions to follow. We'll see you in a minute. So, John, welcome to I was going to say service, but now it's really a program, these evenings together. We're delighted that you've joined us. Many of us will know of you by name, reputation, and by your leadership of Above Bar Church, a kind of local church to us, 30 miles local, I suppose. But who is John Risbridger? What's the man behind the name and the family context and your background to this point?
Oh, well, thank you, Peter. And it's great to be involved this evening. Thank you for inviting me to do that. So, my background is I grew up in a Christian family, not too far away from here in Farnham, really godly parents who prayed for me and loved me and taught me the gospel, for which I'm really grateful. Went off to university, Nottingham, got very involved in the CU world there, which I loved, although in retrospect, I wish I'd remained more plugged in to the kind of rest of the life of the university. It was a bit too much of a bubble in some ways. Then I did health service management for 5 years in the Midlands, East Midlands, which was good, challenging, but fun. And then I had a number of years with UCCF. I had 10 years altogether with UCCF. So still got a big heart for students. UCCF, once it's in your blood, it kind of stays there, I think. And then came straight from there to Above Bar 16, 17 years ago. We love it here. I'm married to Alison. She does lots with internationals. That's her kind of big heart. She's an English language teacher, but does lots within the church with internationals as well. And we've got 2 young adult daughters. Anna's a medical student in Exeter, who's been here during lockdown at home, which has been interesting. And Nicola is a civil servant in London. So that kind of biographically, that's us. I guess in terms of kind of my heart and my vision, there are lots of different kind of angles I could take on that. But a number of years ago, God spoke to me really powerfully through the Genesis 12 Call of Abraham stuff. We were doing a review of mission in the church, and we all read Chris Wright's book about the mission of the people of God, and this understanding that God blesses us in order to make us a blessing where we are and in the nations of the world, and that blessing is a whole life blessing that actually impacts every sphere of society. That's that kind of blessed to be a blessing with a whole life implication has been kind of my mantra for the last decade or so, and really affects everything I do. So I can say more about that, but it means things like worship and Bible teaching and mission and community action, social engagement, they're passions that I carry very strongly.
Yeah, John, great. I mean, that's good stuff. And maybe we can pick some of that up as we move along. So nearly 17 years, you said, in Above Bar, Southampton. And I imagine that, like me here in Lansdowne, Bournemouth, the last 4 months has been, in that overworked phrase, unprecedented.
Yeah.
What was the initial impact on you personally in terms of your ministry, and then in terms of the local church that you're the team leader?
Yeah, I mean, unprecedented, I think, is not hyperbole in this situation. It is just extraordinary, isn't it? It was odd for us in that we had literally just arrived back from Japan, where we've been involved in 3 weeks of ministry in the kind of Keswick-related events there. And so we arrived back from there at the beginning of March. I've been preaching every day, sometimes several times a day while I was there. Pretty exhausted, but full of excitement about what God is doing in Japan. And yet we arrived back from what was meant to be a kind of coronavirus hotspot, as in Japan, and we kind of felt slightly unclean back here. And so we were self-isolating for a couple of weeks here. And then it was lockdown. So, and of course, having been preaching every day pretty much in Japan, really intense, suddenly I haven't preached to a live congregation now since first week or so of March. And when you're a preacher, as you know, Peter, that's quite a big deal, isn't it? So big change. But it was almost like we had Christmas, and then we had Japan, and then we had lockdown. And I almost can't think back to life before then, because so much has changed. We never really had the chance to process our experiences in Japan with friends and with the church, because it was just suddenly into this. So at a personal level, it was fairly dramatic. Obviously, from a church point of view, the moment the Prime Minister said, "Please stay at home," we knew that I suppose we were thinking it was going to happen by then, but we knew life was just going to change overnight. So obviously, as I'm sure at Lansdowne, the building had to shut. But right from the start, really, within the first, 24 hours of that lockdown being announced, there were two things that were really clearly laid on my heart, which I guess have shaped everything since. The first was just the phrase, and I see it everywhere now, so I had already read it somewhere, and I thought it was original. It wasn't. But this whole thing that our building is shut, but the church is open and active, that's become a bit of a mantra for me. And I was really determined from early on that we weren't just going to batten down the hatches and turn in on ourselves and survive. We had to believe that God was sovereign and that he had something for us to do in this. So that was a huge thing. And then three other things just kind of fell into my head a day or so later, that the priorities to pursue through lockdown were to love God in lockdown, despite all the questions it raises and lament and all those things. Love God, love each other. We're kind of separated as a community, but we can still care for one another as a church community. So loving God, loving each other, and then loving our city and indeed the wider world. But we're in a crisis in our city. So those three things, loving God, loving each other, loving the world, have been the three kind of dimensions that I've tried to work in throughout the lockdown.
And John, how did those helpful pillars translate into realities? How quickly did ABC and you adjust and catch up with what clearly God was sharing with you and showing you, and then the impact on your ministry and church leadership in real practical terms?
Yeah. I think basically it adapted pretty quickly, and the team has been magnificent, really, in terms of, and I'm sure the same is true in Lansdowne as well. I mean, getting church online within a week at some level was pretty challenging, but it happens. And, if you look at what we're doing online now compared to what we did the first week, okay, we've come a long way and we've learned a lot, but we were there straight away, and the team did it. I actually decided I wasn't going to be involved in the first week of online church So other colleagues did it. They did a great job. But I felt actually my role was to actually help the church adjust and get a vision for what lockdown was going to be. So I didn't put my time initially into that service, but into engagement with the city and trying to set up some of the pastoral structures that would help get us through. So, yeah, what we did, we started online church straight away. We can talk perhaps more about that in a few minutes. But we also started a kind of daily YouTube-based devotional thing. And initially what we did, both for the Sunday church and for those devotions, was spend kind of a week or so on each of those three pillars. What's it going to mean to love God through this? What's it going to mean to love the city through this? What's it going to mean to love each other through this? And for the first 6 weeks or so, through Sunday church and through the devotions, we were mainly cycling around those priorities. It was actually really exciting with these daily devotions things, because most of them were not delivered by staff or by me. All kinds of men and women in the church with great speaking gifts, many of which are relatively underused a lot of the time, came out the woodwork and were recording sometimes fantastic 6-minute devotions that people absolutely loved. So that was very enriching, but it also meant that we were trying to build a sense that we were on a spiritual journey through lockdown together, even though we weren't physically together. And for the most part, well, God honoured that, I think. And it really
John, can we pick up one of the pillars that you referred to, loving the city? What has that come to look like for you? Because Southampton, I know it myself, it's a sprawling sort of conurbation, lots of churches, lots of things going on. So how did you express loving the city?
Yeah, so pretty much one of the things that we're really blessed in Southampton, I think the same is true in Bournemouth, is there's a pretty good network of relationships between the local churches. We get on well, we love each other. There's a long foundation of praying together, doing stuff together. So there was quite a lot to build on. So in the week lockdown was announced, I encouraged just a Zoom-based call for 13, 14 of the kind of main church leaders, where we just compared notes and we just set an expectation that we wanted to travel through this together. And that was good and continued for several weeks. But then a guy from another church, City Life Church, the one of the pioneer churches here, and a couple of quite enterprising people in our church said, hey, let's just get together and talk again on Zoom about what it could really mean to be the church in the city in this time of crisis. And so we began to network with I suppose 3 local churches especially, although the churchmanship across those 3 is quite different. So between us, we cover a huge kind of spread, and started dreaming about how we could work into 5 key focus areas together. So one was to do with the socially excluded, the homeless and so on, that we've done a lot with over the years. Another was to do with internationals. Again, we've been very involved in international work for a long time, and they were really in need. Another was to do with single parents. We've had a kind of citywide ministry to single parents. Again, they were very vulnerable, and we wanted to look after them. And then we wanted to be aware of the kind of mental health challenges that were around. And then the 5th one's just gone out of my head right now, but it'll probably come to me. But we had these kind of 5 key focus areas where we wanted, the dream was to release volunteers from the churches and to coordinate them with all the different kind of projects and Christian charities that were going around, so that all of the charities were in a place to scale up to meet the needs, and they knew the churches were behind them. And we would really work hard at making sure the churches and those kind of charitable projects were closely coordinated and presenting a common voice to the council. And to be honest, it has been extraordinary. I mean, some of those things have worked really well, some of them have been less well, but the especially the work around getting food to crisis, to families and homeless people in crisis. It's been phenomenal. We've done a lot within Above Bar, but then St Mary's, the HTB church, they turned their whole church into a food hub, which is still supplying shielded families at a large scale. And then, of course, we've got our food banks, City Mission food banks. Those three between them, in the first couple of months of lockdown, 2-3 months of lockdown, delivered the equivalent of about £125,000 worth of food to homeless people and shielded families and people in crisis. And that's still going. So we quickly set up a website to coordinate volunteers that people could refer themselves into, both to volunteer and because they needed support of different kinds. And the relationships that grew around that, it's kind of formed into something that we call Love Southampton, which is, it's not really a thing, but it's a kind of a brand and a network of friends. But that has had an incredible access to the council, especially. I mean, regularly now, council briefings are saying to people in the city, if you're in need, Love Southampton, here's the website, they will help. And then telling stories of particularly food provision. Telephone befriending has been another big part of it as well. So none of us kind of feel we can claim the credit for it, because it's just been this kind of network web of connections that's been established. But I think it has really lifted the reputation of the church in the city and has made a massive contribution to Southampton. One of the council officials comes about once a month to the kind of Zoom meetings that we have. And he actually said to us the other day, to be honest, if we weren't here, it would be okay, because I now know that the churches would step in and look after the city. And that was a fantastic moment for us when we heard that.
Indeed. Yeah, indeed, John. I mean, it sounds very exciting. And in many ways, it mirrors our experience here in the Bournemouth Christchurch pool, working together, identifying projects. You said that some of those things are still continuing.
Yeah.
So that leads me to ask you, we're 4 or 5 months now into this new reality. We've adjusted to it to some extent, and we're far from being out of the crisis. It's an ongoing thing. What are you able to kind of get your hands on the major lessons that you feel that you've learned personally and again as a church? Are you ready to say, yeah, we need to embed these lessons into our culture going forward? Yeah. God has been doing something profoundly long-term amongst us, and we're beginning to get some sense of what those long-term projects might be, and how we might become the church that we now are.
Yeah, that's such a great question, Peter. And I really want to put it back to you and say, what have you thought? Because I think you're a sharper strategic thinker than I am, and I'd love to get your take, but that's probably for another day. I think we're beginning to. I mean, it's a journey, isn't it? But I think we're beginning to. Some of the things are just quite relatively kind of trivial in a way, but like city centre, I'm sure you have the same thing. City centre prayer gatherings in a kind of citywide church. We all kind of want to think that a corporate prayer life together is really important. But honestly, particularly in winter months, getting people to go into the city centre, have to park, leave their car, walk through slightly dodgy feeling streets for a kind of hour-and-a-half prayer meeting. Only the brave do, in a way. Whereas just things like prayer on Zoom has just been revolutionary for us. So actually, my favourite part of every Sunday is 7:30 Sunday evening, where we just have Zoom prayer for 45 minutes. Anyone from the church can come in. We've had, 60, 70 people come most weeks to that. We pray together, we pray in breakout groups. I'm sure that, and as a leadership team as well, we always used to gather for early morning prayer once a week. We do that on Zoom now. It's just so much better. So Zoom has its limitations, but there are some things that are going to be long-term gains from that. I think we're going to travel less, to all our meetings in London that people like you and me go to, Peter. I think we're going to do less of that in the future. But I think more profoundly, an area where I know you had seen this much more clearly, much more quickly than I ever had, was the online church thing. I mean, I can't, and we haven't like formally made this decision, but I just can't imagine that we are going to go back to a place where we don't have a significant online church presence in terms of live streamed or recorded services that people can access. Because there have been so many stories of people watching them with friends and neighbours and unbelieving relatives, and people just watching on spec who aren't Christians. So accessible online services that engage a wide age spectrum. That's been a wonderful part of lockdown, and I can't see we'll want to lose that. And actually, I feel there's been a leadership failure, actually, that it took this crisis for us to take seriously that there are a lot of people who actually physically are never going to make it into a city centre building, but they need Jesus like everybody else. So that's definitely a key area. I think also this whole thing of working together to serve the city, and that's been part of a journey for us over a long period. But I think the days when we saw mission as something we send people away to the mission field to do, we've just got to get rid of that language completely. We still love to send people into cross-cultural mission, but the mission field is in Southampton and Bournemouth just as much as it's in Africa and South Asia or wherever. And that mission is spiritual, material, social, emotional in its kind of dimensions. It's integral. I just feel we've taken some big steps forward in that, and that we want to work together with other churches in pursuing that mission. Lots of things have shifted there that I think will stay with us over the long term. The other thing, just quickly, is that I think small groups have become an absolute lifeline for people. We've always said small groups are important, but they've been a means of survival. But they've actually shown us and shown other people just how important this is. Somebody said to me yesterday, it's the future for people like you and me, Peter, that we're going to be pastors of just a network of house churches. You know, did Crowded House have it right after all? Is that where the future lies? I'm not sure, but for sure, small groups are going to be a much more important part of our strategy going forward. There's more I could say, but that's probably enough to be chewing on.
There's plenty there, John. And as you say, we're all thinking about the strategic impact of COVID-19 for the shape of our hybrid future. I'm sure it's going to be a hybrid future, a physical in-person church experience as well as an online experience. And into all of this, John, about church comes not just the pandemic, but then the Black Lives Matter movement and the racial justice concerns. Again, reflecting on my experience, but wanting to hear your experience, that had an impact. That is having an impact. I was wondering how that impacted you and Above Bar.
Yeah, brilliant. I thought one other thing I wanted to say on the previous one that I'll just do as a headline, which is adaptability. Change is here to stay, and online especially, what works a month ago doesn't work next month, and we just have to keep changing. But that's another story. Yeah, the Black Lives Matter thing, it has felt very significant, hasn't it? And again, it's been one of those things. Was it James Jones said, why did it take a death in the States publicized by social media for us to realise how deep this problem lies, when actually we've had our Stephen Lawrence and all our other stories here in the UK. Why didn't we react sooner? And a little bit like the online church thing, I kind of feel, why did it take this to make us as a nation wake up? But me as an individual, why did it take that to make me wake up as well? Just a few things. I think one of the things it's done for us is made us want to ask people to tell their stories, because we tend to think either this is an American problem or this is a London problem, or it's always somebody else's problem. It's not a in my backyard problem. And so we'll go. I mean, I'm not against protesting, but almost we'll go to our protest marches in order to say, you guys have got to get this sorted out. But actually, I think one of the distinctive contributions that Christians should be making to this debate is, in a sense, kind of incarnalize it, if that's a word, and say, no, this is a landscape we are living in and are called to take seriously. So I have a very dear friend who's a Muslim guy from North Africa, and we run together and talk together and so on. He's a great guy, and I just asked him recently, what's been your experience? I knew he'd been in a few other cities around, and what kind of really worried me is that I'm not going to give the details, but one of his worst experiences, I'm pretty sure, was an experience that he had with somebody in our church family. I don't know who the person is, but somebody who, in the way they spoke to him, made him feel like they wanted to demean him and demean his culture, and they weren't glad he was here. And all of a sudden, it's kind of, this isn't just an out there issue, this is our issue. So we had a forum with our youth. So our youth gather after online church at 11 for a kind of Zoom-based thing. And I led a forum with them a few weeks back, and I just asked them to tell their stories from, college and so on. And pretty much without exception, they all had stories of friends who were from a range of ethnic backgrounds who had experienced very direct racism in school, in college, in their community, in the parks and commons. A Chinese friend of mine in our church as well, very mainstream, integrated. Actually, he's second, third generation British, East Asian. And he told stories about the rough time he was given on Southampton Common by somebody just for being Chinese, and that was very, very powerful for me. So what it's made us think is things like in our online church, who actually gets the microphone, who actually is represented. So we've been thinking more about, particularly when we get people from the church doing prayers and Bible readings and testimonies and that kind of thing, trying to get a much better reflection of our racial diversity as a church in our kind of Sunday expression. But I think we're also more and more aware of the potential glass ceiling around these issues. For yes, we've got, I'm sure, like you, we've got 40 plus nationalities in the church regularly, but we only have one non-white member of our eldership. Is that right? So that's a big question for the future. How can we get that diversity more widely reflected in the church? Two other quick throwaways just to close this one off. When I was at university years and years ago, there were lots of anti-racism rallies as well. But one of the things that often really struck me was that there were also lots of international students who were unbelievably lonely. And through all the different things that CUs and others were doing, I was quite involved with kind of international student stuff there. And what struck me was how few of the people that seemed most active in the protesting were actually particularly active in building bridges, cross-cultural bridges within the university. And it seems to me, I'm not at all against Christian involvement in the political process there. I think that's appropriate. But I suspect the calling of most of us is just to live differently and actually to be the people that are building bridges across the racial boundaries, building friendship across racial and cultural boundaries. And yeah, I think that's absolutely crucial, and a kind of distinctive Christian way of thinking about it. Yeah, there's more I could say. That's probably the main stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, no, John, that's all good. And as you say, it's a challenge. It's a challenge as we shape the future as local churches. So let's talk briefly and towards the end now about the next steps for Above Bar. We've been living in this new normal, and we've a way to go yet before anything like the old normal returns. Not that it will be, as you
Yeah.
said, it won't feel like the past. It'll feel very different. How's Above Bar beginning to position itself for, in-person worship? Do you relish that prospect? What's the risk aversion factor like in Above Bar?
Yeah. I mean, I relish it in the sense that I really miss congregational worship, especially the singing part of congregational worship, where you hear it's a unique thing, because you hear the faith of in our kind of church, several hundred people all at once, and that's very rare. It's a very rare moment and a very precious one. I long for that, but I think it's a long way off, that particular experience. And so the thing that we're wrestling with is it so important for us to be physically back together that we'll go for what we can do in terms of being physically back together, the kind of no singing, face masks, no coffee, all those kind of, because we're so keen on being back together. Or will we say, actually, we can build togetherness and being on a journey together in different ways for longer than this, so that when we do get back together, it actually feels like a big celebration rather than a damp squib. I'm not sure we've quite wrestled that tension to the ground yet. We've formed a kind of pathway back towards of kind of the stages we can go through to get back towards meeting in the building live streamed. And I think whereas most of our services so far have been recorded from homes, we've started now recording them much more from the building. They have been recorded rather than live streamed. I think we'll move towards them being more live streamed, but with recorded kind of elements. So there's a kind of journey we're taking. I think part of our mix on a Sunday afternoon, we do a terrible brand, but it is what it is. We just call it Preach and Pray. Okay, 4:00 Sunday afternoon. Somebody does a 25-minute sermon, because our mornings don't really have a sermon. They're much more all age oriented. And then some up-to-date intercessory prayer, 35 minutes all in. Well, that could be delivered in the building without much difficulty. And the people that really appreciate that, quite a lot of them could potentially experience that live in the building. I wonder if we'll end up doing that more than doing trying to replicate what we're doing in our kind of 10 a.m. online stuff in the building, kind of sooner. But I wonder if well, I'm sure this is true for Lansdowne as well, but we reckon we could get not a lot more than 80 people in our building on a socially distanced basis, maybe a little bit more, but it's that kind of order of magnitude. Probably about 1,000 people would say Above Bar is their church. So what on earth does that mean? Are we going to do 10 services over the weekend, 10 damp squibs over the weekend? I don't know. And actually, what we can do with the people that just turn up on spec? Are we going to be sending them away because we've already got our 80 there? It's so problematic. So I think we will probably find things like watch your online service, but with another household. It makes so much difference. But the other day, we've got somebody living with us at the moment. And last Sunday, for the first time, we just watched online church as a family and with him. It felt so different to be doing that than just us and our nuclear family together. So we're encouraging that kind of thing more, and kind of social picnics and social things that maybe 2 or 3 home groups can do together, socially distanced. I think we're more likely to find our togetherness in those kinds of things, at least in the next couple of months. And then we'll be watching, we're watching the guidelines like a hawk to see the possibilities, but we're not fixed on we've got to be back in the building mainstream as fast as we can, because the church isn't that. At the end of the day, we're still the church, even though we're not gathering in the same way. Does that make sense, Peter? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I'd love to compare notes with you even more, John, but time is against us, and I want to wrap up now. And I suspect that a lot of what you said just now will be picked up in our Q&A that will follow this.
Yeah.
And so issues around, steps out of lockdown into in-person worship. I'd like to hear your view on the kind of civil disobedience stance of John MacArthur over in California, Grace Church. But that's for the Q&A. But for now, John, brilliant session. I've really enjoyed hearing your wisdom, and we look forward to more of that in about 4 or 5 minutes in our Q&A.
That's great. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, John.
It's been great to be with you.